Thank you. Yes, I'll just start with the question. Basically, the question is the title. Are far-right theorists responsible for extreme beliefs? And, well, it's a kind of useless addition. If so, in what way precisely? A little bit about what motivates this question for me. As you said, I'm doing philosophy of law and political philosophy. So what I look at is illiberal political theories mainly, kind of reconstruct them, find out what they're saying and what might make them plausible for some people. So in this project, it's important to me not only to treat it as a kind of system of propositions, but also to kind of find out in what way they actually engage with extremist movements, with illiberal political projects, and what role they kind of play. And this is sort of one way of treating that question to kind of see what precisely they are responsible for. All right. So just a little bit of conceptual clearing of that question. I'm not going to give you a precise definition of what far-right theory is. You probably all know the differences, different conceptions of what right means and what left means. Rather than engage in that exercise, I kind of want to proceed by example. I think it will be clearer that way. And so as an example, I will take the European New Right, which is an ideological movement which kind of developed out of the French Nouvelle Droite with its leading theorist Alain de Benoist. And they have gained some, they're known for being sort of an ideological background for the identitarian movement in Europe, who claim that Europe ought to belong to Europeans and to nobody else. Their ideological beliefs are a bit more complex than just that. They also have a critique of liberal egalitarianism and a critique of capitalism. I will not go into that. I think that should be enough for now. And for extreme beliefs as well, I will not provide a definition, but kind of use it as a heuristic device and go just with one belief that is clearly extreme, at least in my view, namely the belief that Europeans must defend their ethnic identity against immigrants. And so this is one belief that people might deduce from what those theorists of the European New Right are saying. One thing that this Alain de Benoist says, for instance, is that identities can clash with one another. Under such circumstances, it is perfectly normal to defend one's own ethnic belonging above all else, and depending on how you read defend and normal in the sentence, you can already see that this might justify quite violent actions. All right, so just for clarification of the question, the rest of the talk is going to try to answer the question, no surprises there. I'm going first to kind of give a preliminary attempt at an answer, then kind of show how this answer might go wrong, develop a different model for an answer, what I will call the hermeneutic model, kind of try it out in a close reading of one text, and then kind of close it up with some conditions for when or in what way far-right theorists are responsible for extreme beliefs. All right, so to the preliminary answer, I want to go at it that way. Read the question as are far-right theorists responsible for others' beliefs, and more precisely for their readers' beliefs? I think that's a natural way to read that question. And so it's an instance of someone being responsible for someone else's beliefs. And here I had to go a little bit out on a limb because this is not my my field of expertise. So if anyone, I'm happy to be attacked on all this. I'm basing this on a paper. There are three main conditions, and this is very simplified, of when someone is responsible for someone else's beliefs. The first condition is rather straightforward, and I will not talk much about it. It's that A must cause these beliefs. In the case of far-right theorists, I just assume that it's plausible that they cause some beliefs of some of their readers. How widely they're actually read and so on is not a question that I would be dealing with today. The second question ties back to what we heard before about how some people have social roles in which they are more responsible or they are to be trusted by others. And for the purposes of this talk, I will call this having epistemic control over someone else, and roughly define it as that B, so A has epistemic control over else if B relies on what says, and A is recognized as reliable by a relevant community comprising A and B. So what this means kind of is, or maybe it's easiest to explain what I mean with this with one example. So we're usually in matters as a public, we're usually under the epistemic control of experts in matters about which special knowledge is necessary, and we do not possess it. So one instance would be the coronavirus. We were under the epistemic control of virologists in that period because they had to tell us how dangerous the virus is precisely, and we just needed to rely on them, on people who were recognized as reliable. And so the third condition I propose is that A is responsible for her own belief in what she says, and this is where I'm even more out on a limb because I don't know much about doxastic responsibility. I'm kind of drawn to the influence view that A is responsible for her own belief. If she had, she would have had ways to influence it in relevant ways, but I'm just going to leave it very unclear here and hope that this will get me through it anyway. In any case, both of what I'm interested in both of these two things is the role of A, or in our case, A is far-right theorist, so as on the map over there. It's not, as I said, about whether they cause it, but about what kind of expectations we have towards them in their well, with regards to what they write, and with regards to their epistemic role, this is a social role that they might take, as akin to the social role of experts whom we rely on and whom we expect to produce certain results. And as well for their responsibility for their own beliefs, I'm interested in not precisely in what ways they might cause their own beliefs, but in what obligations they might have given their kind of activity over what they will have to do with regards to their own belief. So just to make this clear, this epistemic role will also be different for experts and for laymen. So if I read a newspaper article about virology and the information contained in there is false, presumably, and it's a serious newspaper and everything, presumably I'm not responsible for my own for my wrong belief in this case because I used a reliable source, and that's what I as a citizen have to do. Whereas if a virologist reads the same newspaper article and adopts the same belief, where she could have engaged with the relevant academic literature and found out that that is wrong, she would be responsible, so she has different obligations. All right, so taking this to far-right theory, I propose that there are two initial models of how we could imagine their role, or two kind of straightforward ways to imagine their role. So the first one is to think of far-right theorists kind of on the model of, I don't know, maybe on the model of experts. The idea is that they're the authors of their beliefs. They spend all day thinking about what they're going to write, reflecting about the situations they find themselves in. So pretty much the idea is that they should do everything that they can, and they can do pretty much, to arrive at sound beliefs. And because they spend so much time reflecting, some people, like the relevant peers, not ourselves, will recognize them as reliable experts and kind of just go along with what they say. So this model, I argue, is misleading for two reasons. First, just kind of treating them as authors of their beliefs, or just kind of could do everything or control their own beliefs just by reflecting, kind of neglects the situatedness of far-right theorists, just kind of treats them as people who come up with everything on their own. And treating them as reliable experts just kind of negates all epistemic agency of their readers and just kind of makes them into evil masterminds in control, in secret control maybe of extremist political movements. So it wrongly distributes epistemic agency, you might say. Too much on the theorist side, too little on the reader side. So we could go the other way. Say far-right theorists are not, just don't come up with all this on their own, but they kind of just spell out the ideas that are present in society anyway, and for that they're not responsible, they're only responsible, like the only obligations that they have is making sound inferences from there. And they mainly just provide offers for everyone to kind of browse around in, but that in their relevant communities, they are not recognized as reliable experts. And here, this just goes wrong in the other way, I assume. It just kind of negates all the political agency that far-right theorists actually have, just kind of how they influence other people, how they exercise their own power, and treats them mainly as innocent homme de lettres, working out the implications of ideas. That's also kind of one picture of theorists that we have, and that I argue is misleading. So it seems that we need something in between. All right. And this is where the hermeneutic model comes in. And the basic idea of the hermeneutic model is quite straightforward. It is that far-right theorists are indeed situated, and that what they do is that they interpret situations both they and their readers find themselves in. And the obligation intuition I'm drawing on here is that these situations in which the theorists find themselves in are not the responsibility of them, but the way they go along with them or they treat them is. All right. So how could we make sense of these very vague terms, situations, interpretation more closely? I'm drawing on the concept of situation of Simone de Beauvoir here, and this concept has two main, she treats situations as being shaped by certain social facts, social institutional roles, the upbringing of people in her the second sex, men and women, so men and women have different social institutional roles, are differently brought up, have different narratives about how they ought to behave and so on. And that this, on the other hand, gives them a radically different grasp of the world, at least. And so for this concept of grasp of the world, to make this more precise, to use the term existential feelings by Matthew Radcliffe here. So examples of these existential feelings could just are feeling at home, feeling anxious, as opposed to feeling fearful or feeling insecure. And the idea of this is that such feelings, in contrast to ordinary emotions, you might say, are not experiences of specific objects within our world, but of the world as a whole, kind of mapping onto the Heideggerian distinction here between anxiety and fear, where fear is fear of an object, and anxiety is the perception of one's entire situation as being threatful or threatening, I guess. And so he goes on to describe this as spaces of possibility for activity and experience. So when a situation appears threatening, then everything appears threatening to us, and the activities that seem to be possible are kind of actions of evading that threat. Right, and the interesting thing, I mean, this is Heideggerian, so the distinction between self and world here kind of blurs, is that these feelings are just the inverse of the situations. You could, instead of describing a situation, or instead of saying that you feel anxious, you could also say the world appears threatening. You're kind of describing the same thing from different sides. That's the idea. Where with situation, you look also at how it is brought about by social facts. All right. So the idea is that this is what far-right theorists engage in, and that what they do with it is interpret it, and for interpreting, I want to flesh this out with the notion of providing orientation, meaning first that they articulate this situation in which everyone finds themselves in more concrete beliefs, who help people to navigate those situations and to develop more concrete action options within them, and simultaneously confirming those situations. If you manage to navigate the situation, whatever it is, then you render it more stable, you kind of accept it. And as a social role, so this is what they do epistemically, from which we hopefully can then derive their obligations for what they might need to do within this role. As a social role, kind of what they do is they give starting points for others. Orientations or interpretations are not something that we might just believe, but something that we can only take as a starting point for further reflection, and that needs to be tested in experience. All right, so I know this is very abstract and a little bit vague, but this is why I want to work it out in a reading of one text. And one could do a lot here, especially with the far-right theorists, especially with Benoist. One could look at how conceptions of masculinity appear within his work, power and pride, or many different things. I will stick to this extreme belief here for reasons of time. So this extreme belief, you already have it, or at least the thing that he says, from which the extreme belief may be derived, is that identities can clash with one another, and under such circumstances it is perfectly normal to defend one's own ethnic belonging above all else. And as usual, this sentence is a little bit more complicated than it seems. It implicitly comprises quite a few claims. Just 4 of those claims are that one's ethnic belonging is part of one's identity, and that it is important not to lose it, and also that it may be endangered by others, and then that it is normal, whatever that means, to defend it. So for today, I would just focus on these 2 claims, so that people have an ethnic belonging, and that this ethnic belonging is in some sense important to them. And I want to spell this out as an elaboration or an interpretation of a specific situation of feeling comfortable, or an instance of feeling comfortable, or a situation of comfort, or a situation that's comfortable. I don't know what this is. So comfort, how it is usually described is that the distinction between the self and the world blurs. So as Sarah Ahmed writes, to be comfortable is to be so at ease with one's environment that it is hard to distinguish where one's body ends and the world begins. Using as an example, coming home from work and you lie down on your couch and you kind of just sink in, that's one metaphor, and you just kind of don't feel the bodily boundaries of yourself anymore, and where it's distinct from the couch, or maybe taking a bath. It's also an example. You don't feel where the water begins and where will yourself end. And the idea is that this also happens in social situations. We can intelligibly say that we feel comfortable with some people and others, and one way to spell this out would be to, but the idea here too is the boundaries between oneself and others are not so clear, and one way to spell this out might be to say that one's own and others' actions much effortlessly. Ahmed spells it out with the notion of normality. I don't think it's necessary to go any further into this here. The idea in any case is that with some people and not others, we tend to feel comfortable, or we tend to think we are comfortable. And so this might be old friends, your family, or philosophers, where you feel at home. And it might also be the people from your hometown, the people who you think you share some sort of cultural norms with, that behave in a certain way that is similar to you. And the idea is that Benoist is building on this sense of feeling comfortable with people who people think are relevantly similar to them, in his notion of ethnic belonging. So he writes a lot about communities and belonging to these communities. And what is interesting is that he uses some metaphors to describe these ethnic communities that are all evoke some sense of a place or a community one usually feels comfortable with, or the idea of such places or communities where one would feel comfortable, such as the home, where he, well, this is not very specific to the Benoist, he does it anyway. He says that the political and ethnic community is tied to a homeland, so to a land that is similar to your home, and I take this to mean, or I take this to be an elaboration of the claim that this land kind of feels comfortable to people. And also here he uses the notion of inhabit, which also again evokes this kind of home. And then even more disturbingly for me, he uses the notion of a family for ethnic communities, also kind of tapping into this romanticized picture of families where these are the people you feel most comfortable with. So the people with whom you're least distinct, or at least feel the distinction with themselves, and ascribes it to ethnic communities. All right, so whether or not you go along with me on this analysis, I hope it has made clear how I want to understand this kind of interpreting a situation, making it into something more precise. So from a loosely felt sense of comfort that some people might have within their own culture, within their own hometowns, the Benoist kind of taps into this and kind of interprets it in terms of a homogeneous ethnic community that should be politically active. All right. So from there, now let's go to the account of responsibility again. And as a reminder, we had two conditions that we wanted to look at more closely, the epistemic control and far-right theorists' responsibility for their own beliefs. And we initially described providing orientation as a social role, as the relation to others where others may take one's orientation, the orientation one provides in the text, such as de Benoist with his theory of ethnic belonging, as a starting point for one's own reflection. So the idea is when de Benoist says, well, yeah, you know why you feel comfortable with those people is because you're a shared ethnic community with Indo-European roots and whatever. And people kind of may, if they recognize him as an expert in this field, take that as a starting point and kind of go out and see if they experience it in the way, or if it kind of is confirmed in experience. So that means for what's kind of their obligations are, what kind of their role is with regards to others in this sense, is that they're only responsible for acquiring the relevant beliefs. They have no process, they have no control over the process that goes on after that of confirmation, further reflection, and so forth. That is necessary even as a matter of what their social role is, differently than with other experts. And so with regards to far-right theorists' responsibility for their own beliefs, I suggested that what they are doing to their own beliefs when they're engaging in developing far-right theory is providing orientation mainly for themselves, and that means interpreting situations and thereby confirming it. And I argued that what they're responsible in this sense is for the interpretation. We may treat them as if they just came up with it on their own, the way this author kind of thing. So they need to do everything in there that is possible for them to come up with the right, the best, the morally, whatever, best interpretation of it. So they're responsible, so just to put this in a thing here, they're fully responsible for how they interpret their situations. If other interpretations were available, which is usually the case. I mean, for the cultural comfort thing, there's many different ways of interpreting that. And then we also have the thing that they're confirming it by interpreting it. So for this, I suggest that they're only mildly responsible. So drawing on Garcia here, who kind of explicates what Beauvoir seems to be thinking with regards to the responsibility of individual men for patriarchy. Since masculinity is a situation and as such pre-exists individuals, shapes their existence, etc., individual men are not fully responsible for the existence and perpetuation of patriarchy. We are not fully responsible for the situations we find ourselves in, but to the extent that going beyond these situations would be possible for us, which is a contextual claim, I suppose, a little bit murky on that point. We have the responsibility to try to question where we stand. All right, and now just summing this up in some conditions. So far-right theorists are responsible for others acquiring extreme beliefs. They're not responsible for their having them, but only for acquiring them, only if they cast them. That's what we left out. And the first thing for the interpreting stuff, there would have been other interpretations of the relevant situation available to them, and or they would have been in a position to question the situation which they aim to interpret. All right, thank you.